I learned how quickly a family can decide you're already gone when I heard my own son joke about checking my pulse before the will was even read. And the strange thing was not the cruelty itself, but how comfortably it sat in his mouth. Like a line he'd rehearsed for years, because I was still wearing black from my husband's funeral, still carrying the faint scent of roses and soil, still moving through the house we built together. Yet they spoke about me as if I were an inconvenient delay, a body refusing to cooperate with their timeline, and that was the moment I understood this wasn't grief I was standing inside, it was a countdown. Because before the ground above my husband had settled, the house was already full again, not with memories but with voices that didn't ask permission, shoes that didn't slow down, laughter that bounced off walls that once held quiet. And I stood at the foot of the staircase, gripping the banister he used to polish with his own hands, watching them spread out like they owned the air, the furniture, the future, and maybe they thought I wouldn't notice, or maybe they didn't care. But I noticed everything, the way my grandson slapped bright sticky notes onto the grandfather clock, the leather chair, the cabinet with our wedding china, calling out mine, the way children do at carnivals when they win something cheap. The way his sister walked around with her phone raised, scanning rooms, murmuring about remodels and spa lighting as if I were already a footnote, the way no one offered me a chair, not even out of habit. And when my daughter-in-law appeared with champagne flutes smiling too brightly and said they were celebrating legacy, I realized legacy was just a word people use when they want what isn't theirs yet. Because someone laughed about cleaning out ghosts and my place at the dining table was already gone, replaced by a folding chair dragged in from the garage, one leg wobbling, no cushion, and they pointed me toward the mudroom instead. Said I'd be more comfortable away from the noise, as if dignity were a volume problem, so I sat there facing a mop bucket and a broken broom with a paper plate of dry chicken and potatoes that tasted like chalk, listening as they talked about stripping wallpaper, gutting the kitchen, claiming rooms, because apparently planning your future goes faster when the past is seated near cleaning supplies. And then I heard it again. The words that stuck like a burr under the skin, jokes about me being half gone already, about forwarding my mail to keep pension checks coming, about giving me the garden shed and being done with it. And the strange part wasn't that they said it, it was that they said it casually, without lowering their voices, without checking my face, because when people decide you don't matter anymore, they stop whispering. And I kept my hands steady around my tea, because shaking would have given them something to smile about, and that's when I reached into my sweater pocket and touched the crisp edge of a document I'd carried for years. Not because I planned to use it, but because knowing it was there had always been enough. A bank memorandum signed and notarized long ago, my name written carefully in blue ink instead of black. The kind of detail courts care about even when families don't. And as I listened to them divide up cars, scarves, lake houses, and bedrooms, I remembered how none of this would exist if I hadn't made a decision they never knew about. Because years earlier, when the company was drowning and bankruptcy loomed like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge, it wasn't lawyers who saved it. It wasn't investors who stepped in at the last minute. It was me. Quietly selling every piece of heirloom jewelry I owned, my mother's necklace, my wedding bangles, the brooch I wore the night he proposed, wiring the money without telling anyone. Whispering to my husband to use it and never let them know it came from me, because back then I thought love meant staying invisible, and now here they were, standing in the house that money helped keep. Laughing about how I built soup while he built an empire, as if nourishment were nothing, as if survival were accidental, as if the years of holding everything together didn't count because they didn't come with a title. And someone walked into the mudroom, looked surprised I was still sitting there, told me to grab bottled water from the garage fridge because I looked pale, then left without waiting for an answer. And I stayed seated while suitcases were dragged upstairs and the master bedroom was claimed for the weekend, because when people think you're already gone, they don't wait for you to move. And at some point the champagne ran out and the music stopped, but the smell of greed stayed, thicker than the dust on the drapes. And when I finally stood, my knees ached, and I steadied myself on the sink and looked out the small window at the roses my husband planted wilting from neglect. And I wondered if anyone noticed how quickly things die when no one tends them, and I walked back into the house unnoticed, my footsteps light like the ghost they believed I already was, but I wasn't done, not yet. Because while they joked and planned and claimed, they had no idea I was still counting, still remembering, still holding something they never thought to ask about, and as I felt the warmth of that paper in my pocket, I let them drink and laugh and measure walls because the will hadn't been read yet, and I still had a pulse, loud and steady, and they had just made the mistake of thinking silence meant emptiness, when in truth it was only patience waiting for the right moment to speak. They thought I was just a woman who cooked and waited, but in the next part, I remember the night everything almost collapsed and the secret choice that saved it all. They always believed the story started with him, with the man in the tailored suit and confident smile, but the truth began on a night no one remembers, a night when the house was quiet and the future was trembling. Because long before sticky notes claimed furniture and folding chairs replaced dignity, there was a moment when everything they now felt entitled to was seconds from vanishing, and I remember it clearly. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary in the most dangerous way, the kind of quiet that settles when numbers stop adding up and pride refuses to ask for help. And he came home late that night, tie loosened. Eyes fixed on nothing, sitting at the edge of the couch without turning on a lamp as if darkness could hide the fear. And I didn't ask what was wrong, because after decades together, you learn when questions only deepen shame. And the bank had already called, the clients were restless, contracts wobbling, and one deal stood between survival and collapse, just one. But it required collateral he didn't have and wouldn't admit he needed, and he said it softly, almost to himself, that if this next meeting failed, the company would lose everything, including the house we were sitting in, and then he went to bed pretending sleep could postpone reality, leaving me alone with a clock ticking louder than it ever had. And that's when I made the decision they never knew existed, not because I wanted to be brave, but because someone had to be practical, because fear doesn't care about ego. And while he slept, I opened the back of the drawer and took out the velvet box I hadn't touched in years, the one holding what was left of my dowry, pieces passed down and gifted at milestones when life felt certain. And each one carried a memory heavier than its weight: the necklace from my mother, the bangles I wore as a young bride walking into this very house, the earrings from our wedding night when everything felt possible. And I didn't cry because tears waste time when urgency is present, so I dressed quietly and drove before sunrise to a buyer who didn't ask questions, selling pieces of my past to buy a future no one else would know I funded, wiring the money directly into escrow without leaving a trail that led back to me. And when he woke up, I told him only that things would be okay, to use the money and never let them know where it came from. Because back then I believed love meant shielding someone from humiliation, even if it meant erasing yourself. And 2 days later, the deal closed, investors signed, and the company lived. And they called him visionary, self-made, resilient. Words that stuck and grew until they became myth, and I stood behind the curtain smiling politely, because it didn't hurt then, not the way it would later, because survival feels like enough when you're still afraid of losing everything. And the first time I felt something twist was when the new branding materials arrived, his face bold across the page with a slogan about building alone. And I remember biting my lip and saying nothing because silence had already become my habit. And then there was another night, months later, when he sat at the table surrounded by rejected drafts and shifting markets, pacing again. Frustrated because the board wouldn't approve his plan, and he went to bed leaving papers scattered like evidence of failure. And I stayed up after midnight with a cup of tea and a pen, writing what no one expected me to know. Outlining a multi-phase expansion, a framework built on trends they hadn't noticed yet, because before marriage I'd lived another life, one that required thinking, strategy, foresight. But that version of me had been folded neatly into domestic quiet, and I signed the pages with a name that meant nothing and mailed them without a return address. And 2 days later, he mentioned a strange, anonymous proposal at dinner, laughing that it even looked like my handwriting. And I shrugged because invisibility is easier when you pretend coincidence. And that proposal became the foundation of their next leap forward, the one that brought millions and applause and plaques. And I watched it all unfold without asking for recognition, because at the time it felt safer to be the spine instead of the face, safer to be necessary but unseen, and maybe that would have been enough if it had stopped there. But silence has a way of teaching people the wrong lesson, because as years passed and the company grew, my role shrank in their eyes until it became nothing more than soup simmering on a stove, comfort they consumed without noticing who made it. And now, sitting in a mudroom eating cold chicken while they laughed about my usefulness, I understood something I hadn't back then, that every sacrifice you hide becomes a story someone else tells without you in it. And that's why they could joke about me being half gone, why they could plan to cash my checks and move me into a utility space, because in their minds I had always been background, always been replaceable. always been someone who benefited from success rather than created it. And as I listened to them that day, I didn't feel anger so much as clarity, because clarity comes when you finally see how thoroughly you've been erased. And that's when I remembered the other thing I'd kept, the thing even my husband didn't know the full truth about, because while they were busy taping names onto furniture and carving out futures that didn't include me, there was a folder upstairs beneath linens no one ever touched, holding proof that silence hadn't been the same as surrender. And as I finished my tea and stood slowly, I realized the story they believed about me was about to collide with the one I'd lived, and the gap between those two versions was wider than they could imagine. They thought my only contribution was sacrifice, but in the next part, I reveal the idea that quietly made millions and why my name was never on it. The first time I realized ideas could be worth more than jewelry was the night I noticed how carefully people avoid crediting what they don't expect from you, because brilliance wrapped in an apron makes others uncomfortable. And that discomfort turns into dismissal faster than you'd think, especially when the world has already decided who the genius is supposed to be, and I learned that lesson quietly. Sitting at a kitchen table long after everyone had gone to sleep, the house humming with the low sound of systems we could no longer afford to fail, because after the merger saved the company and applause filled rooms I never entered. Something else happened that no one talks about. The industry shifted, the market tilted, and the same strategies that once impressed investors started to sound dated, and I could see it coming long before the board did. Because when you spend your life listening instead of speaking, you notice patterns others miss, and one evening I watched him pace again, papers spread across the table, frustration sharpening his voice as draft after draft came back rejected. And I didn't interrupt because men who are used to being listened to rarely hear help offered softly. So I waited until the house fell asleep and the quiet grew thick enough to think inside, and that's when I began writing, not emotionally, not dramatically, but precisely, mapping a framework that responded to where the market was going instead of where it had been, outlining a phased expansion tied to emerging supply chains, restructuring valuation logic, and future-proofing growth in a way that sounded obvious once written down. And I didn't do it because I wanted recognition. I did it because I knew the company wouldn't survive without it. And survival had already taught me how invisible I could be, so I signed the pages with a name that meant nothing, something clean, forgettable, mailed it without a return address, and went back to my quiet. And 2 days later, he mentioned it casually over dinner, laughing that someone had sent in a proposal anonymously and that it was surprisingly good, that it even looked like my handwriting. And I remember the way my stomach tightened not with fear, but with something like relief, because relief comes when you realize you were right and no one will know it, and that proposal became the spine of the next leap forward. The one that carried them into rooms where money multiplies quietly and applause sounds like destiny. And 6 months later, when the IPO launched and millions poured in, they hung a plaque celebrating ingenuity with his name etched into permanence. And I smiled, because at the time I still believed the myth that love meant letting someone else be seen whole. And that belief carried me through years of silence as the company expanded and the story solidified, a self-made empire built by a singular mind, while I became smaller in their eyes. Not because I changed, but because erasure is cumulative, and each time I let credit slide, it trained them to expect nothing from me, and that's how jokes begin, how soup becomes a punchline. How a woman who built frameworks worth fortunes is reduced to background noise. And what they never knew was that ideas leave trails even when names are hidden, because when you file something properly, when you protect what you create even if you never plan to use it, the paper remembers. And I had done exactly that without thinking it would matter, registering the framework under the same forgettable name, not for money but for dignity. Because something in me refused to let the work disappear entirely, and years passed and the royalties accumulated quietly, quarter after quarter, numbers that would have changed lives if I'd touched them, but I didn't. Because touching them would have meant explaining them, and explaining them would have meant disrupting the illusion everyone seemed comfortable with, and I told myself silence was still noble. That the family needed one hero, and it didn't have to be me, until the day silence turned into cruelty, until the day jokes about my death came easily. Until the day my place at the table vanished and my contributions were mocked as if nourishment were weakness, and sitting there listening to them plan renovations over my absence. I understood that what I had called patience was starting to look like permission, and permission invites contempt, And that's when the idea of staying quiet lost its virtue, because being unseen is one thing, but being erased while still breathing is another. And as I sat there holding my tea steady, I thought about the folder upstairs, the one beneath linens no one ever touched because no one ever expected me to own anything of consequence. The one holding drafts with ink slightly smudged from tired hands, letters confirming registrations, statements showing value growing quietly in the background like a tide no one noticed until it pulls you under. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if truth entered the room, not shouted, not dramatized, but documented, because documents don't argue, they don't apologize, they simply exist. And the people who underestimate paperwork always do so until it's placed in front of them. And as laughter floated down the hallway and someone joked again about how I wouldn't understand numbers anyway, I realized something that felt almost peaceful, that they weren't cruel because they were powerful, they were cruel because they thought I was powerless, and that belief was about to become very expensive. They laughed because they thought my mind had never mattered, but in the next part, they decide where to put my body, and that decision forces me to stop being silent. The moment silence stopped feeling safe was the moment they began making plans about my body instead of my belongings, because objects can be divided without resistance, but people require permission. And they had decided they no longer needed mine, and I didn't hear it as an announcement. Just a casual decision floated across the hallway like a suggestion about dinner, that it would be better if I moved downstairs. That the larger room was needed, that technically it wasn't even a bedroom but a utility space, which sounded kinder than calling it what it was. And I stood there blinking because language has a way of softening cruelty when it wants to pretend it's reasonable. And upstairs drawers were already opening and closing, suitcases rolling. Laughter following the sound of my life being packed by hands that didn't know what anything meant. And when I stepped toward the stairs, I saw the boxes lined up, not carefully stacked but rushed, labeled in marker without hesitation. Donation, outdated, old junk, and there was something chilling about seeing your history categorized so efficiently, because no one paused to ask what should stay, what mattered, what'd wait. And one of the boxes held scarves I'd worn through winters that shaped us, another held books with notes scribbled in margins, and they were treated the same as broken appliances, and I noticed how easy it was for them, how practiced. Because erasing someone is simpler when you've already decided they're finished, and that's when I understood the folding chair had been a test, the mudroom a warning, but this was the conclusion, because when someone says you don't need a room, just a bed until you're gone, they've already placed you on a timeline you didn't agree to. And I heard laughter after that line, not cruel laughter, worse, polite laughter, the kind people use when they don't want to seem involved. And I walked slowly toward what was now mine, the laundry room they'd cleared just enough to justify the word space. A cot pushed against the wall, no sheets, just a moving blanket, a bare bulb buzzing overhead. Bleach and dampness clinging to the air, and my suitcase already waiting as if I'd agreed. And there was a moment where I considered speaking, not loudly, just enough to remind them I was still here, but something stopped me. Because protest would have given them a reason to frame this as concern, as care, as inconvenience. And I refused to let my dignity be turned into an argument I couldn't win. So I nodded and carried my silence like armor. Because armor doesn't clank when you need to move quietly, and later, when dinner was served upstairs, the smell of meat and wine drifting down, someone left me a towel and a bottle of unscented shampoo like charity. Told me I could eat after they were done, and I nodded again because acknowledgement would have cost me more than silence did. And that night, as I sat on the cot opening a tin of soup with the edge of a key because no one thought to leave a can opener, I heard the phrase again, whispered like a joke they thought I couldn't hear, that I built soup while he built an empire. And it struck me then how often nourishment is dismissed by people who have never gone hungry, how quickly care becomes invisible when it's constant. And I ate slowly, not because I enjoyed it, but because finishing felt like defiance. And when the house finally went still and footsteps faded, I walked back into the kitchen for water and found the photo they'd taken down, the one from our anniversary, face down behind the refrigerator wedged between cleaning supplies. And I held it longer than I meant to, pressing the cracked glass against my chest because it reminded me that this house had once known another rhythm, one built on effort instead of entitlement, and that's when something shifted inside me. Not anger, not grief, but clarity, because clarity arrives when you stop asking why and start asking what. and what I knew was that the story they believed about me had been built on years of my cooperation. Years of stepping back so others could step forward, and they had mistaken that for weakness. And as I lay on the cot staring at the flickering bulb, I thought about the folder beneath linens no one ever touched, the drafts with smudged ink, the registrations, the proof that silence had never meant absence, and I realized that keeping quiet had served its purpose once, but now it was only serving them. And when silence becomes permission for cruelty, it's no longer virtue. It's surrender, and I wasn't done surrendering parts of myself to make others comfortable, because comfort is a luxury for people who have never been erased. And before sleep took me, I made a decision so small it felt insignificant, but so firm it changed everything. Because in the morning, I would take that folder and make a call, not to threaten, not to demand, but to be heard by someone who understood paper better than people. And as the house breathed around me, finally quiet, I understood that they thought moving me had ended the story. But all they'd done was remove the last reason I had to stay silent. They gave me a cot and called it kindness. But in the next part, I walk out with a folder and make a call that changes who owns the truth. The morning I left the house with that folder under my arm, no one noticed, not because they were busy, but because they had already stopped tracking my movements. And there is a strange freedom in being overlooked. Because invisibility lets you walk straight toward truth without resistance, and I remember the air being colder than expected, my steps slower than they used to be, but my thoughts sharp in a way they hadn't been for years. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about how to survive the day quietly, I was thinking about how to end a story properly. And when I reached the payphone outside the pharmacy, the one I'd used years ago before everything became touchscreens and assumptions, I dialed a number I hadn't needed in decades. And when the voice on the other end answered, I didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't soften my words. I simply said it was time, and there was a pause, not confusion but recognition, the kind that comes when someone has been waiting without knowing when the call would come. And the next morning I sat across from a desk polished by generations of careful decisions, laying out documents one by one, not dramatically, not defensively, but with the calm that only preparation gives. Because paper has a language that doesn't require emotion, and the first thing placed down was the trust certificate, my name beside his, not as a witness or beneficiary, but as co-founder, co-executor. The kind of designation people overlook until it matters. And then the bank memorandum dated years earlier showing the deposit that saved the company when collapse was minutes away. Every dollar traced, notarized, undeniable. And I watched the eyes across from me narrow not in suspicion but in understanding, because professionals know when they're looking at something that's been buried intentionally. And then I slid forward the handwritten drafts, yellowed at the edges. Ink pressed harder in places where I'd paused to think, and I didn't say much because explanation weakens proof. And when the question finally came, quiet and measured, asking if I was the author, I answered honestly that I was. That I had sent it anonymously, because at the time the board wouldn't have followed a woman, and saying it out loud didn't sting the way I'd expected because truth feels lighter once it's shared. And what followed wasn't outrage or disbelief but process, because truth doesn't explode, it unfolds, and within hours the handwriting analyst was involved, loops and pressure points examined, signatures compared to letters saved for years. And the conclusion arrived without drama, a match so clear it didn't require argument, and then came the part they never anticipated, the explanation of ownership. How ideas protected properly don't disappear just because credit was given elsewhere. How royalties accrue whether they're collected or not, how silence doesn't erase authorship, it just delays recognition, and when the numbers were mentioned. Figures that would have made the family gasp, I felt oddly detached, because money had never been the reason I stayed quiet or the reason I was speaking now, and when I was asked what I wanted, I surprised myself by answering without hesitation, not revenge, not apology, not even payment, but my voice back. Because having your voice taken is more damaging than having your name erased, and as I gathered the folder and stood to leave, I understood something essential, that preparation doesn't announce itself, it waits. And while they were upstairs planning inheritances and counting assets that didn't legally belong to them yet, the structure beneath their certainty was already shifting, because wills can be revised, trusts can be enforced. And recordings have a way of preserving truth people forget they ever spoke aloud. And as I walked back through the cold air toward a house that no longer felt like mine, I realized they were still operating under the belief that I was passive, that humiliation had weakened me, that moving me into a utility space had finished the job. And there is nothing more dangerous than an enemy who underestimates patience, because patience looks like submission until the moment it moves, and by the time I returned, boxes were still stacked, plans still being made, jokes still flying about what would be sold and who would get what, and I listened without reacting because reacting would have warned them, and warnings are gifts I was no longer giving, because everything was already in motion, signatures pending. Filings prepared, transcripts queued, and the will they believed would crown them had already been reshaped into something else entirely, something precise, something cold, something honest. And that night, as I lay on the cot staring at the same flickering bulb, I didn't feel small, I felt centered, because for the first time in years the story was aligned with reality again. And when the call came confirming the final revisions were complete, I thanked no one, because gratitude wasn't necessary, preparation was, and as sleep finally came, I knew the next room I would sit in wouldn't have a folding chair. And the next time my name was spoken, it wouldn't be as a joke. They walked into the will reading smiling, but in the next part, a recorder clicks on, and everything they said about me becomes evidence. They arrived that morning dressed for victory, not mourning, polished shoes, confident smiles, the kind people wear when they believe the outcome is already written, and I noticed how carefully no one looked at me. How their eyes slid past as if acknowledging me might somehow contaminate the certainty they'd rehearsed on the drive over, because when people expect inheritance, they expect silence from obstacles. And I was still wearing the same old coat they'd mocked months earlier, still seated where I'd been directed, still apparently harmless, and my son leaned toward his wife and muttered that I shouldn't expect a dime, that I wouldn't be around long enough to spend it anyway, and the words landed softly, not because they lacked cruelty, but because cruelty loses its edge when you know it's about to be recorded forever. And when the papers were distributed and the room settled into that artificial quiet reserved for legal authority, I felt the shift before anyone else did, the kind that happens when confidence outruns preparation. Because when the briefcase opened and the small recorder was placed on the table, something flickered across their faces. Not fear yet, just confusion, and confusion is the first crack, and the voice that filled the room wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, measured, unmistakable, the voice of a man who knew exactly what he was doing when he planned this moment, and the first words froze the air, because he spoke not about assets or gratitude, but about consequences. About how every word spoken against his wife would be counted, tallied, and deducted, and I watched my son laugh at first, a short sound that died quickly when the recording continued, because laughter relies on disbelief. And disbelief evaporates when your own voice starts playing back things you forgot you ever said. And one by one the statements came, casual insults, jokes about my death, remarks about my usefulness. Words spoken freely in kitchens and hallways when they thought power protected them from accountability. And with every sentence read aloud, I could see realization spreading unevenly across the room. Because some people understand consequences faster than others, and when the totals were announced, numbers so large they stopped feeling real, the room went silent in a way I'd never experienced before, not awkward silence. Not polite silence, but the kind that presses inward, that forces people to hear their own breathing. And my son stood abruptly, anger rising fast because anger is easier than fear, accusing, denying, insisting this wasn't real. That it wasn't fair, that I had drained him for years. And I spoke then, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly, because clarity doesn't need volume, and I said he would have done the same if he'd been paying attention. And that was when the final shift happened, because attention is a luxury people don't give to those they underestimate. And as the documents changed hands and names were read, my name, spoken properly, attached to ownership, to authority, to decisions that would stand long after the room emptied, I felt something settle in me, not triumph but alignment, because truth feels right even when it hurts. And I watched the color drain from faces that had been so sure of their future minutes earlier, because certainty is fragile when it's built on assumptions, and the words primary beneficiary landed without drama but with weight. The kind that bends posture and steals breath, and my son's confidence collapsed into something smaller, something almost childlike, asking questions too late, and the recorder clicked off, and for the first time since my husband's funeral. No one spoke at all, because there are moments when language simply can't keep up with reality, and as I gathered my coat and prepared to leave, I felt the strange calm that comes when humiliation changes direction. Because humiliation isn't about volume or spectacle, it's about exposure, and theirs had just become permanent, documented, undeniable, and as I walked past them, I didn't look back. Because justice doesn't need witnesses once it's complete, but the story wasn't finished yet, not quite, because there was still one document unopened, one truth they hadn't prepared for. One final correction that would explain everything they thought they knew about who built what and why. And as I reached the door, I heard the question finally spoken aloud, the one they should have asked years ago, asking how I could have done all this without them knowing, and I paused just long enough to answer honestly, because you don't see what you refuse to value, and the door closed behind me, leaving them with silence heavy enough to force reflection, and I knew the last thing they were about to hear would change how they remembered every joke, every dismissal, every folding chair forever. They thought humiliation was the end, but the final document proves the empire itself came from the mind they erased. The room hadn't recovered from the silence yet when the final envelope was opened, and that was intentional, because truth lands hardest when there's nowhere left to hide it. And as the last pages were placed on the table, I could feel their confusion sharpening into dread, because confusion asks questions, but dread already knows the answer won't be kind, and this time the explanation was slower, more deliberate. Because what followed wasn't punishment but revelation, the kind that rearranges memory itself. As the documents traced the origin of the company's most profitable framework back 15 years to a filing none of them had ever bothered to read. A filing submitted under a forgettable name that suddenly didn't feel forgettable at all, because when authorship was confirmed and the intellectual rights were formally reassigned, it wasn't just money changing hands. It was history correcting itself, and I watched as understanding dawned unevenly across faces that had once looked at me like furniture. Because it's one thing to lose an inheritance, and another to realize you've been living inside someone else's mind without knowing it. And when the numbers were mentioned, steady annual figures that had quietly accumulated for years. The room seemed to shrink because abundance feels threatening when it exposes how wrong you were, and someone whispered that it couldn't be possible, that I'd never worked in finance, never run a company, never been more than what they saw. And that's when I understood the final cruelty wasn't what they did to me, it was how small they had allowed their imagination to be, because they couldn't picture intelligence unless it wore a suit or raised its voice. And when the final letter was read, handwritten, apologetic, honest in a way only regret can be, acknowledging that the credit had been misplaced and the silence had been encouraged because the world was not yet ready to listen to a woman like me, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt complete because completion doesn't require applause. It requires accuracy, and accuracy had finally arrived. And when they were given their deadlines, their instructions, their remaining allowances, I didn't watch closely, because endings don't need supervision once the terms are clear. And later, when boxes were carried out and keys were set down, I moved through the house slowly, not reclaiming it, just saying goodbye properly, because some spaces absorb too much disrespect to ever feel like home again. And as I peeled the last neon sticker from the furniture and dropped it into the trash, I realized how symbolic it had been, how easily people label what they didn't earn, how confidently they claim what they don't understand. And outside, I paused by the garden, where so much had been uprooted for plans that never came to be, kneeling to water a stubborn plant that had survived neglect simply by holding on. And I understood that survival doesn't always look strong in the moment. Sometimes it looks quiet, patient, underestimated, and that patience had finally paid its debt because I didn't keep the house, I let it go. Choosing space over history, peace over proof, and when I moved closer to the sea, into a place where no one needed to justify my presence or measure my usefulness, I carried very little with me. Because when you've spent years being reduced, you learn what actually matters, and the funds that arrived afterward were steady but unimportant compared to what I did with them, because recognition delayed feels hollow unless it's shared. So I built something new, something quiet, something that wouldn't need permission, a way to support women whose work had been swallowed by louder names, whose ideas were sitting in drawers or inboxes waiting for someone to listen. Because I knew how it felt to whisper brilliance into rooms that only respected echoes, and the sign I hung by my door made me smile every time I passed it, not out of bitterness but humor. Because humor is what remains when bitterness has nothing left to feed on. And inside my new home, I kept one drawing taped to the fridge. A childish sketch from years ago of me beside a light bulb with words written in crooked letters saying I thought better than machines. And I kept it because it reminded me that the truth was always visible to those who looked without judgment. And when people ask now how I endured being erased for so long, I tell them I wasn't erased, I was waiting. Because waiting isn't weakness when it's paired with memory, and memory is power when it's finally allowed to speak. And if there's anything this ending proves, it's that silence doesn't mean absence, that care doesn't mean compliance. And that the minds we overlook often hold the maps we follow without knowing, because they buried me while I was still thinking, and that was their mistake. Because thinking doesn't stop just because no one's listening, it sharpens, it plans. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it doesn't ask for permission, it simply rewrites the ending.